80 men who had spent 6 years believing they were superior to everyone around them submitted a written request, in careful military language, asking for one simple thing. They did not want to sleep next to ordinary soldiers. They considered it beneath them, even now, even in defeat, even behind barbed wire with their entire world in ruins. That request landed on the desk of one of the most uncompromising generals in the entire American army. And the way he answered it would force these men to confront the one thing their rank had always protected them from: the truth about who they really were. It was May of 1945. Germany had fallen. The war in Europe was finished, and across the shattered countryside, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers sat behind wire, waiting to be processed, waiting for the chance to go home. Inside one particular prisoner of war camp, holding roughly 5,000 men, two very different groups of Germans found themselves living side by side. The regular Wehrmacht soldiers and the SS officers, Hitler's self-proclaimed elite, his true believers, the men who had chosen the cause rather than been handed it. To understand what happened in that camp, you first have to understand the depth of the hatred that existed between these two groups. A hatred that the rest of the world rarely saw. The Wehrmacht were the regular German military, professional soldiers, and a great many of them had been drafted. They had served because their nation demanded it. They had followed orders because that is what soldiers do. Some believed in the cause. Many simply wanted to survive and return to their families. They were, in the end, ordinary men caught inside something far larger than themselves. The SS were something else entirely, and they made certain everyone knew it. They were volunteers, every single one of them. Not one had been forced into that black uniform with its silver insignia. Each had chosen to join Hitler's elite organization. They held themselves to different standards, trained differently, and carried a belief that ran deeper than any battlefield discipline. They believed they were superior, not just to the enemy, but to everyone, including the very Wehrmacht soldiers who had bled and fought alongside them for years. For 6 long years, this hierarchy had been absolute and unquestioned. SS officers gave the orders. Wehrmacht soldiers obeyed them. The SS received the better equipment, the better rations, the better quarters. They were the chosen ones, and the entire German war machine was structured to remind everyone of that fact, every single day. But that privilege came at a terrible cost, and the men who paid it had not forgotten. The Wehrmacht blamed the SS for the very worst of the war. The atrocities, the war crimes, the fanatical, suicidal fighting that dragged the conflict on long after any reasonable man could see it was lost. Ordinary German soldiers had died in their thousands because SS commanders refused to surrender ground that meant nothing. Entire units had been thrown away because the SS demanded total commitment to a cause that was already finished by the spring of 1945. That resentment had curdled into something much darker over the years, a quiet, simmering hatred. And the reason it stayed quiet was simple. Even in defeat, even behind the wire, the SS still carried themselves as though they were in command of everyone around them. When the Americans processed the prisoners into this camp, they separated officers from enlisted men, but not out of any respect for German military tradition. It was purely practical. Officers in one area, enlisted in another, standard procedure. The sleeping arrangements, though, were a different matter. The camp used large tents, each holding around 30 men on cots, arranged in tidy rows. Basic, but adequate. The Americans did not sort the prisoners by unit or allegiance. They simply assigned men to tents as they arrived, which meant Wehrmacht and SS ended up mixed together under the same canvas. For the first few nights, the SS officers did what they had always done. They claimed the better positions, the cots near the tent entrances, the spots with a little more air and a little more space. The Wehrmacht men took whatever was left over, just as they always had. The pattern of the war continued seamlessly into captivity, as if losing had changed nothing at all. Then, on the 4th night, an SS major named Major Richter decided he had reached his limit. He could not tolerate sleeping among common soldiers any longer. The snoring, the smell, what he saw as the complete absence of proper respect, all of it had become unbearable to him. So he gathered several of his fellow SS officers, and together they drafted a formal request. It was written carefully, in precise, professional military language. They cited regulations. They referenced international conventions on the treatment of prisoners. They argued that officers deserved separate quarters regardless of national affiliation, that mixing ranks violated military tradition and undermined discipline. But beneath all that careful wording, the meaning was crude and simple. They did not want to sleep beside men they considered beneath them. The request made its way to the camp commandant, an American colonel, who read it and very nearly laughed out loud. The SS officers, who had spent 6 years lecturing the entire world about their superiority, were now asking to be physically separated from the men they had led into total catastrophe. The colonel could have simply denied it on the spot. Instead, he wanted someone higher up to see it for themselves. So he sent it up the chain, to division, and division sent it onward, all the way to 3rd Army headquarters, where it landed on Patton's desk that afternoon. Patton read it through. He had been dealing with SS prisoners for weeks by that point, and the experience had worn his patience paper thin. Almost all of them were arrogant. Even in total defeat, even stripped of everything, they still carried themselves as though they were special, still expected privilege, still believed the rules that applied to everyone else did not apply to them. He picked up the telephone and called the camp commandant directly. He asked how many SS officers had signed the request. The answer was around 80, mostly majors and captains, with a handful of colonels among them. He asked why they wanted separate tents. Because, he was told, they did not want to sleep alongside regular soldiers. Patton went quiet for a moment. Then he asked a different question. How many Wehrmacht soldiers were in the camp? Around 4,000, came the reply. And how, Patton asked, did those 4,000 men feel about the SS? The commandant understood instantly where this was heading. They hate them, sir, he answered. They blame them for prolonging the war, for the worst of everything that happened. Patton's response was a single word: good. And then he laid out exactly what was going to happen. Every SS officer who had signed that request, all 80 of them, was to be packed into one single tent. A large one, but crammed tight, shoulder to shoulder. And that tent was to be placed directly in the center of the Wehrmacht section, surrounded on every side by the regular soldiers who despised them. He added one final instruction. The Wehrmacht men were to be told exactly who had asked for special treatment, and exactly why. Let them know the SS believed they were too good to sleep next to them. And then Patton said he would be coming to visit the next morning to see how the officers were settling in. That evening, the Americans moved them. Guards arrived at the various tents where the SS officers had been sleeping, read out names, and ordered the men to gather their belongings. The officers assumed this could only mean one thing. Their request had been granted. They were finally getting the separate quarters they deserved. They packed quickly, and some of them actually smiled. At last, they thought, the Americans understood. At last, proper recognition of who they were. They were marched across the camp, past row after row of tents, deeper and deeper into the Wehrmacht section, until they arrived at a single large tent that had been erected that very afternoon. Inside, 80 cots had been jammed together, with barely enough room to turn sideways between them. Richter stared at it, then turned to the guard and said there must be some mistake. There was no mistake, the guard told him. This was their new quarters. One tent, the major said slowly, for all of us. That is right. We requested separate quarters. Richter protested, away from the enlisted men. The guard smiled at him. You got separate quarters. You are separated from the Wehrmacht now. You are all together. Just the SS, exactly like you wanted. And in that instant, Richter understood what had truly happened. This was not accommodation. This was punishment, delivered with a precision crueler than any beating. The officers had no choice in the matter. They filed into the suffocating tent, found cots, and tried to settle into a space that made settling impossible. They were pressed shoulder to shoulder, no privacy, no air, no room even to stretch. And outside, the Wehrmacht soldiers were already gathering, because word had traveled fast. The SS had demanded special treatment. They had declared themselves too good to share a tent with ordinary men, and the Americans had answered that arrogance in the most fitting way imaginable. The Wehrmacht did not attack them. The American guards would never have permitted it, and besides, they did not need to. There was no satisfaction to be found in violence that came close to the satisfaction of simply standing there and watching the so-called elite crammed together like cattle, watching the men who had once issued them orders now reduced to conditions worse than their own. Because at least the regular soldiers still had room to breathe. That first night, not one of the SS officers slept. The tent was unbearably hot, the air thick and stale with the breath and sweat of 80 men, packed into a space meant for far fewer. And through the canvas walls, they could hear the Wehrmacht soldiers outside, talking late into the night, laughing, mocking, savoring every moment of it. The next morning, Patton arrived. He moved through the camp with the commandant at his side, inspecting facilities, checking conditions, the routine visit of a commanding officer, until they reached the Wehrmacht section and the large tent at its heart. "This is where we put them, sir," the commandant said. Patton looked at the crowded tent, at the miserable officers packed inside, at the Wehrmacht soldiers gathered around it grinning, and gave a simple order: "Bring out the one who wrote the request." The guards went in and brought out Richter. He stood before the general and tried to hold himself with proper military bearing, but the night had stripped something out of him. He was exhausted, filthy, hollowed out. Patton studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You requested separate quarters," he said. "Yes, sir, because you did not want to sleep with regular soldiers." "We felt it was inappropriate," Richter answered, "for officers to share quarters with enlisted men." "Officers," Patton repeated. "Is that what you are?" "Yes, sir. Major Klaus Richter, Waffen-SS, an elite unit." "Elite," Patton said. "That is an interesting word. What exactly made you elite?" Richter hesitated, sensing the ground giving way beneath him. "Superior training," he said carefully. "Higher standards. Total commitment to the cause." "The cause," Patton said, "being a war that killed 50 million people. We served our country." "No," Patton corrected him flatly. "You served Hitler. There is a difference, and you know it." He gestured toward the Wehrmacht soldiers watching from beyond the wire. "Many of those men were drafted. They had no choice in any of this. You volunteered. You chose all of it. And now you stand here believing that choice makes you better than them." Richter said nothing. Patton stepped closer. "These men fought the same war you did," he continued. "They bled in the same mud. They lost in the same defeat. The only difference is that they did not choose it, and you did. And the moment it all went wrong, you blamed everyone except yourselves. You wanted separate quarters because you think you are better than them. You are not. You are worse. They were soldiers following orders. You were fanatics, following a madman straight off a cliff. And now you want privilege in defeat, because you cannot bring yourself to accept that your elite status was always a lie." Riker's face flushed deep red, but there was nothing he could say. This was an American general in an American camp, and his rank, his insignia, his entire identity meant precisely nothing here. Patton turned to the commandant and asked how long the officers would remain in that tent. "As long as they are here, sir," came the answer. "Could be weeks, perhaps months." Patton nodded, then looked back at Richter one final time. "You will stay in there until you are processed and sent home," he said. "All 80 of you, crammed together, while the soldiers you thought you were better than sleep comfortably in proper tents. And every single morning, you will wake up and remember that your rank and your status and your superiority were all built on a foundation that collapsed the instant you lost." He paused. "Maybe one day you will understand that you lost because of what you believed, not in spite of it. Richter was dismissed and sent back into the crowded tent, and Patton continued his inspection as though nothing remarkable had occurred. But the message had landed exactly where it was meant to. For the next 6 weeks, the SS officers remained in that tent. They adjusted, because they had no other option. They found ways to endure the closeness, the heat, the relentless humiliation. But they never grew accustomed to it. Not truly. Every day, they watched the Wehrmacht soldiers living in comfort, rested and at ease, better off in every way than the men who had once commanded them. And every day, the lesson drove itself a little deeper. Their hierarchy was gone. Their privilege was gone. Their superiority had been a fantasy, and it had died with the Reich. Some of them changed in those weeks. They began speaking to the Wehrmacht soldiers, quietly apologizing for the arrogance, for the fanaticism, for the decisions that had cost so many lives. Not all of them, but some. Others remained bitter to the end, convincing themselves that this was nothing more than American cruelty, that they were the real victims, that their cause had been righteous even in its defeat. Those men went home unchanged, still believing, still waiting for a vindication that would never arrive. The Wehrmacht soldiers went home, carrying the memory of having watched their tormentors finally brought low. The SS officers went home knowing that their lifelong claim to superiority had been put to the test and found utterly worthless. And somewhere in that suffocating tent, across those 6 brutal weeks, a hard truth had settled permanently into their bones. Titles and ranks and claims of elite status mean nothing at all the moment you lose. Defeat strips away everything a man has wrapped around himself and leaves only what he actually is underneath. And for the SS, that revelation proved harder to survive than any battle they had ever fought. Patton never wrote about the incident. To him, it was simply another problem handled, another group of difficult prisoners managed, one small piece of an enormous occupation. But for the men inside that camp, both Wehrmacht and SS, it was something far larger. It was the moment the old order died completely. The moment the hierarchy that had shaped their entire military lives was revealed for what it had always been: arbitrary, fragile, and built on nothing. The Wehrmacht had spent years being told they were lesser men than the SS. For 6 weeks, they watched that lie turned completely inside out, and not a single one of them felt the slightest pity about it. So here is the question worth asking yourself. Would you have done what Patton did and let the consequences of their own arrogance teach them the lesson? Or would you have kept them apart, kept the peace, and let them go home still believing they were better than everyone else? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories from the war, about the moments when old hierarchies finally collapsed, make sure you subscribe.